Greek and Roman naming systems. Introduction. The approach to naming and developing a naming system reflects a unique language and its evolution. Since the Greeks were more inclined to adopt everything new, it is unsurprising that many of the first Christian congregations were formed on their lands. Christian communities grew and flourished in cities such as Patras, Corinth, Thessaloniki, Philippi, and Athens. The tradition of Christian naming led to a decline of tria nomina first in these parts and then across the whole empire. Initially, tria nomina consisted of praenomen, nomen, and cognomen. However, later Roman names were shortened and used alongside Greek names. Due to a combination of sociocultural factors and economic issues, Greek names gradually ousted the Roman ones, borrowing some aspects from them and establishing a cultural continuity. Analysis. At first glance, there was a notable similarity between the two naming systems. At the same time, the Roman approach to naming contained several critical distinctions from others, including the Greek one, which eventually supplanted it. For instance, the existence of the praenomen, or the first name, should be mentioned as one of the other attributes of the Roman naming framework. The remnants of the specified naming system can be found in the present-day context of most languages, with the first name and the last name being the key elements of the naming system as it is applied to people. Therefore, the framework used in ancient Greece and Rome acquired a tremendous legacy in the millennia after both civilizations ceased to exist. However, for a number of reasons, the Roman naming system collapsed sometime after the collapse of imperial power in the West. The praenomen had already become insufficient in written sources in the 4th century, and by the 5th century, it was preserved only by the most conservative parts of the old Roman aristocracy. As Roman institutions and social structures gradually disappeared during the 6th century, the need to distinguish between nomens and cognomens also disappeared. The Greek naming system, vice versa, spread across the country. By the end of the 7th century, the population of Western Europe had returned entirely to individual names. However, many of the names that originated within this trial nomina have been adapted for use and have survived. To understand the reasons and key driving factors behind the described permutations in the naming framework and the transfer from the Roman approach to the Greek one must consider the socio-economic and socio-cultural factors driving the change. Specifically, delving into the history of ancient Greece and Rome evolution, one will spot the undeniable and overwhelming effect of the elite as the demographic that shaped the socio-cultural context and defined its changes. Therefore, it would be reasonable to conclude that the introduction of the praenomen and the gentilicium, or the family name, can be seen as the direct influence of Roman culture. Namely, the fact that the presence of the elite class was significantly more pronounced in the Roman community should be regarded as the core factor behind the described developments. Additionally, linking the change in the naming system and the relevant trends, one should also focus on the fact that the use of the gentilicium, or the family name, was initially associated with the ruling class, namely, the emperor and the affiliated people. Therefore, the tradition of incorporating the last name into the naming framework should be attributed to the permutations within the social system and hierarchy of ancient Rome and Greece. Furthermore, the tradition of excluding women's family names and using men's ones instead can also be seen as an extension of the Greek naming framework, which would percolate into the Roman approach to the naming process. Defined by the specifics of the gender roles within the Roman and Greek communities and the overall inequality between men and women in the specified societies, the described framework for naming was eventually imprinted onto the European naming conventions. Conclusion. Thus, it can be concluded that the Greek naming system, initially used only for slaves and servants, triumphed over a more prestigious Roman equivalent. On the one hand, the reasons for this were changing the social structure of society, where social strata gradually became less pronounced, and, on the other hand, the emergence of Christian ideas within Greece. Moreover, the natural tendency for shortening played a significant part in this process, making the Greek naming system preferable to the Roman one.